Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Advanced Calculations and Dashboards webinar. My name is Frank Ziamba. I'm a senior consultant and trainer at Spider Strategies. Here's a picture of me along with my email address. Also shown is our education email, which is learn@spiderstrategies.com. Quickly, just a couple of webinar logistics. First, this webinar is being recorded and will eventually be made available to all registrants. All attendees are currently muted and will remain so throughout the entire session. However, if you have any questions during the session, you can post them here and we'll either respond during the session or after. Next, I'd like to quickly cover our agenda. We're going to be showing a number of advanced calculations that can be leveraged within the product. We'll then review reports and dashboards that can be built to more quickly identify and address a problem. And with that, let's jump right into QuickScore. With my apologies to our scoreboard customers, please note that the displays will look a little different from what you're used to, but most of the functionality is exactly the same. Okay, so I've already logged in, and what I'm looking at here is an objective called increase revenue, and beneath that, I've got three measures that we'll be leveraging. The one that I'm going to be picking on a lot is product revenue. Now, under this second objective here, I've just called that calculations, and you'll notice that I've got a measure called total revenue. And what this one is doing is it's summing up product, training, and book. If I hover over this, you can see that a couple things here. The measure IDs that this is tied to, and if you click on it, you can actually get into more information as well. So nice things that you can drill into to get information here. And if you hover over each number, and I'll do this a couple times today, so to just get a feel for this, it becomes more prevalent as you start getting into more advanced calcs like I will. But you'll notice that there's some nice behavior here if you drill down, and it'll show you the actual measure name itself. And then you just click close to get out of that. So if you've watched our training videos that we have on the website, you've seen this calculation for total revenue performed before. What I'm going to do today, and our main goal is to provide a few more challenging examples. So the first one I'm going to do, and I'm going to go into edit mode here first to start. So within here, within edit, I'll just quickly show you where that equation comes from. This is where you could click it within here, and you can get to that same spot that I just showed you with the hover. If you go into edit mode, you can actually see how this was put together here. And within here, if you clicked on each of these measure IDs, notice how these are going to be changing down underneath the measure drop down there. So I'm just going to click cancel. Now I can continue editing this measure here. Maybe I messed up a measure name or things like that. But towards the bottom, there's a really nice option here where I can, of course, move and delete. I don't want to delete right now to blow this away, but there's an option called copy. And what I'm going to do is leverage this, and I'll click on copy here. So maybe this total revenue calc that I've got there, maybe there's a lot of logic that was brought across. And I want to bring that across into a new measure here. What I have to do is identify where do I want to drop this copy. And you'll see that it defaults to a certain organization, which I'm going to leave alone. I'll be working exclusively within Advanced Calcs and Dashboards org today. Now on the right, I can drop this copied measure into a number of spots here. So I could drop it under increased revenue. And what I'm going to keep doing today is working with the calculations objective here. And I'm just going to select that and click copy. And what you'll see here is that you'll notice that the original measure will stay up at the top. Anything new will show up at the bottom there. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that new measure that I've created here. Now, my goal is, well, first thing is to clean up the name. All right, so immediately what I'll do is call this something else. And my first goal that I'm going to show you here is this showing you total revenue, going about it slightly differently, just to start giving you a feel for the different functions that you can get into. So we have a function called sum, and the only difference I'm going to make is drop that label at the end. I'm going to work my way back down to the bottom here, and I'm going to click exactly where I was before on this other measure. So I'm going to go click within the equation section there. And a couple things that I'll do here is I'm going to type in, to change this, I'm going to type in the word sum and drop a left parentheses, and you'll see we're going to start getting into more advanced items that we can get into. Now you might say, hey, you just dropped in the word sum. How on earth did you do that? And how did you know what to do there? And you might have not have been aware of this before, but what you can do is double click on that label once I type that in. Sum, of course, I've got to have some clue of something to start this with there. So I've started with sum, the easiest one I would say to work with. Once you have that in place, you can just double click on it. You'll see that here's that sum function, most popular one. There is an average option we'll get into in a minute. And if you go to other, you'll see there's a whole laundry list of stuff that you can get into here. One of the items that we'll be working with is the if function, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. All right, so to get out of that kind of drop down view here, I'm just going to click on something on the display. I'll just click on a gray section of the dialog. You want to be careful when you're clicking within here. Okay, as I showed you before, clicking within the equation box could impact certain things. You'll notice that when I click on a certain measure ID here, it'll bring that item across. I could accidentally start deleting things that I don't mean to. But in this case, to get the sum function to work properly, excuse me, what I need to do is replace the plus with commas. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I want to replace this first plus and the second plus and drop in a second comma there. Grab some water quick, sorry. And then I'm going to finish the equation. Whenever you bring across a left parentheses, I need to introduce a right paren as well. Okay, so a couple changes here. I needed to know about the sum function. I needed to know that when I introduce this, some of the functionality needs to be different. So I replaced the pluses with commas. And whenever you bring in a left paren, you've got to close it with the right. Now you might say, well, what's the big deal about this? Ultimately, it's going to produce, hopefully, the exact same calculation as the one that we started with there for total revenue. Just wanted to show you how you can go about this in a different way. Okay, so I'm going to click done. If I don't get any error messages, that is a good thing. The last thing that I want to do here is maybe just scrutinize this a little bit. That looks good to me. The last step is to click save in the bottom right. When I do that, you'll notice that the name at that point just took. So remember I did the copy of total revenue. I essentially pasted it over. It keeps the properties of the original until I click save, which I just did. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, before I start moving on to the other calculations here, I will click done and just kind of audit my work this first time around here. And what you'll see here is that if I click on the original total revenue for the month of April, I had a total revenue of 800,000. If I click on this new one, I'm doing exactly the same thing in a different way. This better be the same value, okay? So good news is that that is 800,000 for the month of April. Now, again, the same things that I showed you before on that original total revenue. If you hover over it, it'll show you what the function looks like at the bottom there. Again, if you click on this, it'll get into the same exact behavior that I showed you before, just working through things in a little bit different way there. Okay, next I'll build a few more examples here. So one question that we get frequently is how to build a year-to-date calculation. And I'll demonstrate how to do that by building a year-to-date calc for the product revenue measure shown at the top. So this measure here. Now the question is, well, how do you go ahead and do that this time? Previously what I did was I went into edit and did a copy and essentially a paste there. I'm just going to work through this a little bit differently now. So what I'm going to do this time is click on calculations, the parent item, and then I'll click on new scorecard item up at the top. I need to give it a name, and I'm going to call this product revenue year to date. And then I'm going to work my way down to the spot that we're going to be working with extensively today, which is the actual value dropdown. And we're going to be working continuously with calculated. All right, so now you're seeing from the ground up how this comes about. So you'll see it defaults to manual. I can change that to something else, in this case calculated. We'll touch on this box in a couple minutes here, but the main item that we're working with today is set equation. So I'll go ahead and click that. All right, so the next thing that we'll do here is notice a couple things here, is that under the type dropdown, you'll notice that our default is measure, and we'll see that there are a few other options out there. I could base a calculation based on the normalized score, so that 0 to 10 that you see in a number of places throughout the product as you work your way up to different levels, objectives and perspectives and things like that. I could actually base a calculation based on that normalized score. Not what I want to do right now. I could use this to date for year to date. Yep, that's the one I'm going to grab in a second. Other thing I just want to draw your attention to as well here is there is the ability to base a calculation on an initiative. Okay, so those are the different items I can get into. What I'm going to do right now is select to date. So that's step one. And then the next thing I'm going to do is say, well, what measure do you want to perform a year-to-date calculation on? I'll do a select a measure there. So again, as I mentioned before, I'm going to stick with this org on the left. So I'm not even going to speak to that anymore beyond this. Now on the right, I do have to do some work here. I've got to identify which measure from my tree do I want to do a year-to-date calc on. And I'm going to go ahead and select product revenue. And I'm going to be picking on product revenue over and over again. And we'll click that and click done there. All right, so once I've got that, now the next couple things to be aware of, I'm actually at a point where I can just click add at this point, but before I do that, let's speak through some of the other options here. Our default is to do a year-to-date calc of the actual value. If I go to the drop-down, I could change that to a threshold. I'm not going to need to do that typically with my to dates. Sometimes I do get into that, but usually it's the year-to-date of the actual value that I want to grab there, but good thing to be aware of there. Now, the next thing to be aware of is the calendar, the periodicity. And typically when I'm doing year-to-date, I usually you'll see this set to yearly. If you do have a custom calendar where you get into something like a fiscal year, maybe you're going from October to September, and that's what you want to do your year-to-date on. So if you're in November, you want the year-to-date to be summing up October and November values. So there is the capability to change this calendar to something else. That's a good thing to be aware of there. Now, just as importantly with being aware of that fact is that this value that you see here has to be greater than what's set up for the measure definition of the product revenue measure that we're working with. So I'm not going to go there right now because I don't want to lose my place here, but if I were to go to product revenue and click edit, you'd see a frequency out there, and that frequency would have been set to monthly. All right, so the fact that that value was set to monthly and this option that you're seeing in my default is something higher than that in scale. So this could have been quarterly. Again, usually this is set to yearly. But the main point I want to make here is that if this measure was set to yearly, unfortunately, this drop down here is being set to yearly wouldn't work for me because they would be of a like nature. All right, so be careful with that. All right, and the last thing is the aggregation type. And you'll notice that there's two options here. Typically, I just leave this alone. I'm looking to do a year-to-date sum. Very infrequently have I even thought about working off of average there, but if you need that, just be aware of the fact that it does exist. You have to select it. All right, so that's it at this point. Now, the last step to bring this across, once I've got all this laid out the way I want it, is to click add. And at that point, you'll notice that it comes across into the equation box there. All right, now in the equation box, be mindful that it does bring across whatever work that you did, but it's a little bit more cryptic. All right, so you'll notice that this equation can get quite lengthy. You might have layers of things that are out here. So we try to truncate this to as much as possible to kind of make this more readable. And just one of those things that are coming across that are truncated right now is the value of TD, and that replaces the words to date. All right, but everything else is pretty intuitive. Yearly, sum. I picked the actual value that came across there. Now, the other thing here is that I haven't really spoken to is this ID. And IDs are critical. and you'll notice that what came across here was 4361. When I did the selection and I picked product revenue, what's nice here is I see both the measure name and the ID. The ID is the key piece that establishes uniqueness of that measure in where it sits in the tree. All right, so product revenue could sit, in this case, it sits under increased revenue under advanced calcs and dashboards. But that same measure could be under my finance department. It could be under the top level company level. And the thing that establishes a difference between product revenues is this ID. All right, so you'll notice that is the key value that's getting brought across in my formula there. All right, with that, I'm happy with the way things look, and I'll click done. All right, and the last step is to click create, and that actually produces that measure, or creates the measure there. And then you'll notice now the product is saying, okay, I'm going to assume that you want to create another measure at this point, which I do. All right, so the question is, do you want to keep going down the path of essentially at this point, what I just did on this last item was new scorecard item. And it basically will keep going down that path when I click create, basically meaning that, okay, I can create a new name and things of that nature here. Now, a good trick with this is, let's just say I'm about to produce something called average revenue at this point. Now, I could start from scratch, or if I've got something in place that is very similar to what I'm about to do, why don't you click on that item, in this case, total revenue sum, the one that's got that change that I just made a couple minutes back. And let's go about that trick where I showed you the copy. So let's go back to that initial option that I showed you there. And you get a feel for which of these two methods you prefer. But in this case, I'm going to say, yeah, let's do that copy again. I like that. And I'm going to drop this underneath. Where do I want to drop it? I'm going to drop it underneath the calculations objective again. And I'll click copy. So again, anything new will get placed at the bottom. What's your first step? You want to immediately go up to the top and rename it. And I'm going to type in the value of average revenue there. All right, when I did the copy, notice some of the work is done for me. Is calculate is there, the equation's down the path of whatever measure I've copied. And believe it or not, the only change I'm going to do on this one is replace sum with the word average. All right, so I can either just select it or type it. And believe it or not, I am done with what I'm looking to do here with average revenue. Now, of course, I want to make sure of the fact that, what am I averaging? Okay, so when I summed up product revenue, training, and book, is that true with average in this case? And the answer is yeah, I want to bring across my average for product revenue, training revenue, and book. So in 2 seconds here, once I click done and save, I have moved my way through producing a new type of equation there. Just got there as efficiently as what I deem humanly possible to get there. Okay, so those options that I just showed you here, yeah, good to know, but still relatively easy to build here. Now, what I'm going to introduce now is something a little bit more complicated, and we'll get up to more layers of complexity as we go here. But what I'm going to do is a 3-month moving average, which what this is going to do is going to take the value of product revenue in a given period, and it's going to add it to the prior 2 periods and take the average. All right, so we'll have a 3-month moving average as we scroll across up in the top right. So this time, what I'm going to do is I'll start from scratch. I'm going to click calculations. I'll click new scorecard item and work my way through creating this measure from scratch here. And the first step, if you go down this path, is you've got a blank name. I've got to go down and provide a value, product revenue, and I'll just call it 3-month moving average. So I spell out exactly what I'm doing here. Down at the bottom, again, I'll switch this to calculated, and I'm going to switch, or actually select set equation here. All right, so to start the equation, if I'm doing this from scratch, nothing got copied over like I just showed you with the sum, and I just quickly changed the word sum to average here. So if you go down this path, what you might need to do at this point is start typing on your own. And what I'm going to start this with this moving average is, again, something similar to what I just did. I'm going to start it off with AVG with the left parentheses there. Down at the bottom, I've got to now select which measure do I want to do this moving average on. Again, I'm going to pick good old product revenue here. So I'll click on that and click done. All right, so that's just selecting it within this basically selection screen here. I haven't introduced that measure yet into the equation box. And I need to make sure I click add to bring that across here. And again, I've got to grab a sip of water, my apologies. All right. Okay, so I've brought across the measure that I want to do an average. And now we're going to start getting into more complexity here. So the next thing I'm going to do here is say, okay, I'm happy with bringing across the current period's actual value for product revenue. That's going to be step one. Step two, I want to bring in the same measure. So if I want to introduce the same measure, maybe a different measure, but to separate those, I need to introduce that comma again that you saw me do earlier. Now this one I'm going to get a little bit trickier. And what you'll notice down here on the bottom right, there's a period option, which was defaulting to current. Now what I'm going to say, hey, let's go ahead and bring across the option called earlier. And when you click that, notice what happens here is that I get the period column gets introduced here. And what that's bringing across now is essentially one period prior, again, the actual value, again, the same measure. If there was something else that I wanted to introduce, I could have potentially selected a different measure. But right now with this moving average, I'm going to keep picking on product revenue, just adjusting the periodicity there. Okay, so again, I've done my selections here. I haven't introduced them up into the equation box until I click add. All right, now you're gonna see stuff getting a bit more complex here. Same measure, 4361. This minus 1p is the representation of one period prior, okay? So the question is, if you're doing 3 month, well, I probably need 3 measures up there, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and drop in another comma. In this case, I've already got this work done here with the earlier selection. The only thing I'm going to tweak here is the period and switch that to a value of 2. Okay, so again, I've just made some selection changes at the bottom, haven't introduced them into the equation yet until I click add. All right, so up at the top here, bring across the value for product revenue in the current period, the prior period, 2 periods back, and average them. It will bomb on me if I don't close this with the right parentheses, okay? So be careful with all your rules of math. All that stuff from way back when come into play here. And I've got to make sure I drop in that right parentheses to close that out. Sometimes you have multiple parentheses that need to be closed out. So in the simplest case, I usually just have a left and a right. All right, so believe it or not, that will produce, hopefully, a 3-month moving average. To do that, I'm going to click done and click create to get that brought across. And now we'll move on to our next example. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to 2 types of if then else logic, which I personally find the most fun to work with, and hopefully you do too. I mean, it's more challenging, but I like being challenged somewhat. So let's go ahead and move through the first example. And the first example I'm going to show you is just a simple check. And obviously you can get a lot more complex than this, but I'm just going to do a check to see when the product revenue actual value is greater than its goal. All right, so that's going to be as simple as I'm going to do with this. And the first step is give it a name. So I'm going to call this product revenue to goal, product revenue versus goal, actual versus goal, whatever you want to be more specific with that. But basically the product revenue actual value versus the goal is what I'm checking here. Okay, so I've given it a measure name. Now, the next thing I'm going to do for the first time today is talk about data type. All right, so previously what I've been doing here is it's just merely moving along, leaving the data type as currency. Why did I do that? Is because all of these prior measures here all were currency related. So basically summing up dollar values, total revenue, sum, year to date, average, all this stuff was currency related. For the first time here, what I'm going to be doing is introducing a measure where essentially I'm bringing back a value of 1 or 0, which has nothing to do with the dollar symbol or whatever currency you have in your sphere there. Now, to do this, all I need to do here is go to data type. If I want to make that change, is switch that to something else. And in this case, I'm going to make that number. All right, so that important step there, just so you don't get misled with certain designations of the value being brought across there. All right, so the next step is, again, changing the actual value to calculate it. Seen that a few times here. Go to set equation to move back to our equation box here. Now this time to start the equation, I'm going to throw something completely different at you. I did reference this a number of minutes back, but I showed you in the drop down, there was, when I brought in sum, I double clicked on it, and then I showed you right around here, there was a drop down, and I scrolled down to the word if. And lo and behold, I'm finally to that point where I'm ready to bring that through into my equation. So the function is if, and then I need to start using my parentheses, as you've seen me use with sum and average. So I'm going to introduce those two things there. Now, same thing as we've seen it before. The question is, well, what are you ifing on, right? What are you doing a check as far as your if then else? So typically what you're doing now is the selection of a measure. So I'm going to go ahead and select product revenue again. Usually, of course, there's different things that I'm selecting, but I'm just keeping it as simple as I can right now. Just working off of one measure to show you a number of different calculations that you can get into here. Okay, so I select the measure again. It's only selected here. I have not brought it into the equation until I click add. Okay, this one I'm gonna throw a little curveball on you, and I'm gonna do a check to see if the actual value, notice I left all this alone here, is greater than, so I'm gonna introduce some math symbols. I'm not gonna get into what those are, but they're what you'd expect. You know, the greater than symbol that you see here, there's a less than symbol, you can do equals and all that good stuff. I'm just gonna talk about greater than in our webinar today. So, but the good news is if you've worked with us in math in the past, those symbols are going to be similar to what you put in up at the top here. Okay, so I'm doing a check if this value is greater than what. And what I'm going to do a check on is, again, the same measure, product revenue, but I'm going to throw this curveball and say, well, I'm going to do a check on a threshold value. And in this case, I'm going to pick goal. Okay, so you'll notice that the screen now shows me the same measure. This threshold, again, is only selected here. I've got to click add to bring that across up at the top. And now you're going to see some syntax here that's different. All right, so as soon as I bring in a threshold, your clue that you're working with some kind of a threshold value is the T. All right, so that's what that T is all about. We do nicely spell out which threshold you're working with here with the separated by a comma by the fact I picked gold there. If I picked red, this would have looked a little bit different there. Okay, so if actual value is greater than the goal, then what? What do I want to bring across here? And this is where I'm going to start throwing in some syntax here. And what I need to do is introduce a comma. So you've seen that a few times here. But what I'm going to throw in different this time is I'm going to introduce the then piece after the comma. And what I'm going to do is, and this can be anything as far as what makes sense, but what I'm going to say, if this is true, bring across a value of 1. Okay, and then typically what you're doing here is then bringing across the else after that. I'm going to introduce a second comma here. You can put some spacing in there. Just be careful with, you know, certain things matter. Spacing, I usually don't get too carried away with spacing, but I could introduce spacing here. Just be careful with how you play around with things and making sure that you don't delete certain values that you're introducing into your equation there. Okay, so I've got the then after the first comma, the else after the second. What do I got to be careful of? Make sure I bring in the right parentheses to close out the left at the beginning. And then always a good idea to kind of speak this through in English to make sure this is doing what you'd expect it to. Of course, you've got to understand what the syntax it's looking for. So the question is, all right, if the actual value of product revenue is greater than the threshold or the goal value of product revenue, bring across a 1. Otherwise, bring across a 0. If I click done, don't get any red messages. I've done the syntax correctly. And that looks good. All right, so I've clicked done. Last step is to click create. All right, so I want to show you one more illustration of an if then else calculation. And I'm going to throw at you this time a check for nulls. All right, I'm going to do a check to see when the product revenue measure is null. So guess what? I'm going to call it product revenue null or is null with a question mark. So that's my first step there. At the bottom, same things that we've been dealing with. This will be a number. So I will be bringing across ones and zeros. So the fact that that last measure I created was a number, the next one that I create picks up the like property. That could be a good or a bad thing. You know, it's simple enough to go ahead and change that, but just be mindful of, you know, I'm just kind of cruising through some of these things right now, but all this stuff can matter depending on what type of measure you're creating here. So calculate it again. This time I'm going to stop here for a second, and I'm going to stress this box for the first time. This box here, really important. I've just kind of been glossing over it and just skipping right over it actually. There's an option here called, how do you want to handle things that are blank? Do you want to treat them as a zero? Do you want to treat them as NA? Do you want to treat them as a blank? If one piece of an equation is missing, do you want this computed value to be brought across as blank? That's kind of a dangerous option. You might have a calculation that's summing up three values, as I showed you before: product, training, and book. And you might get to the point where somebody has updated product revenue, somebody's updated training, but they were just negligent in updating book. If you were summing those three things up and that book revenue is blank, this calculated value, in that case total revenue, would remain blank until that book revenue number gets plugged in. All right, so that could be exactly what you want. It's just something that you need to be aware of here. Now, in this case, I'm doing an actual check for blanks. So this is a really important option here that I want to make sure that this option says treat missing values as blank, or my result that I'm about to do might not work properly. All right, so be mindful of that. I'll just kind of leave it at that for now. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is set equation. Go back to the screen here. And what I'm going to go through now is something similar to what I just did, if left parentheses. And now I'm going to throw out you another curveball here and say, hey, by the way, we have a function called ISNULL. All right. So I'm going to drop that in, accept it for what it is, that the fact that we have this function out there. Notice that there is no spacing. All right. So I don't have is space null. This is the function name. It has to be typed in exactly as that, or it will not work. All right. Now, once I bring in like another type of a check here, notice that I'm going to be introducing another left parentheses. So what this is going to mean is that I better have two right parentheses once I'm done with this equation. But everything else is going to be pretty similar to what I just showed you here. So I'll kind of move through that quickly. Which measure do I want to do a null check on? Again, good old product revenue. Click on it, click done. To bring it into the equation, click add. Great, I've got it up there. Now, the rest of this is going to be exactly the same, except that I'm going to close this parentheses first. All right, so I'm just is null check. I'm going to close that out. Everything else is going to be exactly the same as what I showed you in the last example. So I'll kind of quickly move through that. Comma 1, if it's true. If it's false, bring across a value of 0, and I'll speak this through in English in a second. But this syntax at the end is exactly the same as what I showed you before. So now in English, what is this doing or checking for? If the product revenue value is null, bring across a value of 1. If it is not null, bring across a value of 0. All right, so that's what we're doing. We haven't checked if all of this stuff works, but for now, we're going to click done and we'll click create. All right, so believe it or not, we are now to the point where we are done with creating all of our calculated columns here, or measures, I should say. Now, at this point, for the first time in a while here, I'm going to click done to get out of that edit mode. Okay, so we've already audited the total revenue versus the sum measure. So this is the one that we started the session with. We already took a look at that. We made sure that this number was exactly the same as the one before that. Wonderful. So let's start taking a look at the rest of the stuff here. So product revenue year to date. What I'm going to do is going to go back to the original measure, which is what is really building up all the stuff that we were working on here before. So I'm going to go actually to that source measure, product revenue. And what I'm going to do is take a look at the actual values now here that we see here. Let me just focus in on starting off with March. You'll see a value of 450,000 here and here. Somebody plugged in that number. If I go back to February, the value is 400,000. And if I go back to January, the value was 480. Now, if I were to sum all those three things up, well, actually, let's just kind of take this 1 month at a time here. So I've got a value of 480 plugged in for product revenue for January. If I go to product revenue, and I'm not working off of a fiscal calendar, that October, September example, if I'm basing it on the calendar year, the number for January should be exactly the same as the number shown at that prior measure, 480, exactly what it was before. Now, as I start moving to the rest of the year, calendar year, and I click forward, this number is not going to be just the value itself. It should now be summing up the value for February plus the value for January. And I can click within here to audit some of these things here, where we can see, yeah, it's summing up a couple things there to get to a year-to-date calculation. As I work my way through the rest of the year, this number is just going to keep growing exponentially. I should be over 1 million once I get to March. And sure enough, I'm at 1.33 million. All right, so I've done enough of an audit right now to say, yeah, this is performing exactly the way I expect it to. If you're familiar with the product, there's a change value that you can see here, where this value is 450,000 higher than the prior month. If I go to product revenue here, you'll see, yep, there's the value, 450,000, that is getting added to the year-to-date sum there. Okay, so that looks perfect to me. Let's go to average revenue. And let's go back to January. Take a look at that here. So this one's a little bit different now. So this is the only measure where I've taken not just product revenue, but total revenue. I also brought in some other things to it. But this one, what I'm looking to do is take the value for product revenue, add it to training, add it to book, and divide those things together by 3. All right. So if I take a look at this value here, if I click on it this time here, let's take a look at that and say, okay, now great. It looks like it's got 3 measures out there. Again, if you know that little technique of hovering over, you'll see where each of those values are coming from. I showed you that 480 for January for product revenue before. But if I were to click on training revenue and book, you would have seen 210 plus 50. Sum these 3 things up, divide it by 3, break out a calculator. Hopefully that comes to 247. Eyeballing that quickly, that looks good to me. So we're going to call that one good and click close to get out of that. All right, let's move on to this more challenging example, product revenue 3-month average there. Now, this one's kind of right now where I've got numbers plugged in. What this should be doing right now is taking the value for January plus the value a period back December, 2 periods back November. You're saying, well, you got 480, what's going on there? Okay, so the question is this calc not working properly? Or if I click on it, you'll notice, nope, poor Frank just didn't load in any values for December of 2019 or November of 2019. Those are blank. So what the product is doing, saying, sorry, you're poor negligent person there, you're not going to have these values sitting there as blank until somebody goes in and loads those values in there. So right now the average for January is just January's value. If I moved ahead to February, it's going to be a little bit different now. So I've got 2 numbers that exist, the value coming across for the current period and then the prior period, 480. Good old December is still blank. If I move ahead 1 more period here, now for the first time, I've got 3 numbers that are successfully being computed. If I click on it, you'll notice that, yep, here's our current period value, 450, 400 for February, 480 going back to January, divide that by 3. Hopefully that comes out to 443. All right, so that gets a little, and then what will happen now is I keep moving into April and May, it's just gonna keep giving you that nice 3-month moving average. So that can come in handy there. All right, so let's move on to the next check. Again, I like auditing everything that I do, and what I'm gonna do is go back to January to start my audit here. Okay, so if I go to product revenue to goal, again, this one was checking actual value versus the goal value, and you've got a value of 1, and you're like, what did I do again? So this is where we're gonna click on this 1 and see, all right, what on earth did we try to accomplish here? So again, refresh your memory, what we were doing here is we were doing a check of the actual value for product revenue. In January, it was 480. We wanted to see if it was greater than the goal value for January, which was 470. Because that's true, I said, if that was true, I want to bring across a value of 1. So lo and behold, I've got a value of 1 there. Now, purposely in February, I've got the reverse true. All right, so I just want to make sure, at least in a test case, and I will do this even in a production environment, just plug in some numbers that will kind of make both sides of this equation work. I want to make sure it's behaving the way I'd expect before I deploy this out to a customer, let's say. So I'm going to go ahead in February, and I've nicely got the reverse true, where I've got, in February, I've got 400,000 for the actual. Again, the goal is still 470, but this number is way lower now. So because this is not true, I'm now in the else side of the house, and I want it to bring across a value of 0, and that's exactly what I've got here. All right, so I am perfectly content with this formula working the way I'd expect at this point. All right, so let's go ahead and audit this last one here, and I'm just keeping an eye on time here. Product revenue null, and I might need to speak a little bit more quickly, I apologize. Okay, so let's go back to January and again start that audit here, and again figure out what we're trying to accomplish here. So let's click on this again, and what we're doing on this one is we're just doing a simple check of the actual value to see if a value essentially got plugged in for the actual or not. And the answer is yeah, somebody went in January and plugged in a value of 480,000. Because they did that, this is true. It is essentially not null. So because it's not null, I'm sorry, I misspoke a second back there. So this is not true. I'm now bringing across the else side of the house for January. And you'll see that there's a value of 0 that came across. So that's good. If I were to go ahead and move across to February, you'll see zeros coming across there. But take a look at year 2019 here. Whole bunch of 1s up there. Now, typically 1 means a good thing. So you can play around with 0s and 1s as far as how you want that ordering to come across. But in this case, what 1 is bad, all right? So we'll see here is product revenue has been null for the entire prior year. The question to ask yourself, is that good or bad? Should somebody have plugged in some numbers for 2019? Did they just fail to do that? And the answer might be, yep, they failed to go into product revenue. And if we go to December, lo and behold, this number is blank. All right, so that could be a nice quick visual here as far as where things are sitting and maybe inappropriate. Now, this might be a new measure that you just introduced, just started tracking it January of 2020. So maybe in this case here, this display that we see is perfect and behaving exactly the way we want there. All right, so just wanted to give you some examples as far as some complex formulas that you can get into. All right, so believe it or not, we're done with calculations and we're gonna move on to leveraging some of these things maybe into some advanced dashboards. So for the first time today, we're gonna move into the section called dashboards. So we've given you a couple sessions on dashboards already, so we're gonna kind of jump down the path of, well, things that are already built here. And the example I'm showing you here, I've got this dashboard entitled Intervention Required. And what we're looking at here is we're tracking on this dashboard sales and finance. Maybe I'm a manager of both departments. So I'm curious about what are our red measures for sales. Let's just focus on the top here. And let's go ahead to the month of April. So the prior month. All right, so we're right now towards the middle of May. How do we finish up in the prior month? So if we take a look at this, what we're gonna say is, okay, great, for sales, we've only got 1 measure. I might have 50 measures out there that I'm responsible for within sales. Only 1 of them is red. That's the good news there. Now, on the flip side here, there's another thing that I can take a look at here is take a look at downward trending. And we see here that we've got 3 measures that are trending downward from the prior month, which in this case is March. Now, let me just speak to this by focusing in on finance here for a second, and I'll show you how I kind of play these two against each other here. Down at the bottom here, I've got more measures that are in the red. And if I scroll, it's like, oh no, I've got a whole bunch of measures in finance that are sitting in red for the month of April. And you might get to the point where you're like, oh my gosh, this is too overwhelming. And where do I start, right? As far as trying to audit this and track down, do I start with product revenue, book production? I don't know. Maybe if I bounce this against the downward trending report on the right, what you'll notice is that Oh, okay. I've got product revenue that's sitting in the red here for the month. It is also trending down. All right, so there's it's like a double gotcha here on this one here. It's in the red and it's also trending down. If I were to quickly eyeball the rest of this, even though this looks the same, this is actually a measure book production, completely different measure book revenue. So this is the only one, product revenue, that is sitting in both reports, meaning to start my day, I'm gonna start troubleshooting product revenue. And maybe I talk to the person that's responsible for that particular measure, let's say, or maybe that's me, and I just get on the ball and try to improve that number there. All right, so anyway, that's one way of tracking particular report like this where you can get into advanced view, and maybe within a couple seconds here, I've been able to pinpoint a particular problem. Now, if you like this, you might say, well, this is cool. How did you go ahead and do that? And I'll show you how that was built up. So this was actually built up not on initially on dashboards. It was built up using the section charts and reports here. And you'll notice that I've got one individual report. So this is our good old measure up at the top there, that training revenue, sales revenue. So this is that piece of the puzzle there. I've got an individual report for that, individual report for downward trending for sales, and the same for finance there. Now I could click edit within here and show you how that was built up after the fact, but let's go the extra mile here and show you that from scratch. And again, I'm getting short on time here, so I'm gonna somewhat move through this quickly here. Under new reports, if I click on that, you'll see that there's options here. If there's an option that sits out here on the left, and lo and behold, I'm looking to build a red measures report. If it's here, go ahead and grab that. All right, so wonderful. It's going to get me down a lot further down the path than the next example that I'll show you. So I'm going to click on red measures here. And the question is, well, what red measures report do I want to track? Now, for the first time, I'm going to go to mobile world here just because it's got some more built up example than the webinar org that I was showing you before. So I'm going to focus in on the sales section within there. I could pick the entire mobile world if I wanted to, but I'm just going to key in on sales. I just want to see red measures for sales. I could pinpoint a certain measure, believe it or not, on the right as well. If I'm happy with the entire sales department, let's say, all I need to do here is click next. Now, within here, the question is, what do you want to look at? Do I want red measures for just the current period? And in the example I showed you before, I said, yep, just give me the red measures for the current period. So great, I can just leave that alone up at the top. Now at the bottom, you'll see that by default, there's some additional columns that are brought across that you may or may not want. And it's just simple enough to deselect. In this case, I'm going to remove description and owners and merely click finish at this point. And guess what? I've got that one measure report that I showed you before for the sales side of the house. So this looks good to me there. The last thing I need to do is make sure I save it. So I'm going to go ahead and click save and give it a name. I'm going to call this red measures sales, and I'll just drop the word training to differentiate it from my original there. Okay, and I can click edit and move this down. I can reorder things here, just put everything new that I build down at the bottom for the moment. Okay, this next one, so downward trending. This one was a lot trickier to build. So let me walk you through that. So again, this has got a 2-month comparison. And again, it's looking to see where are those items that are trending down. So for this one's easy enough to pick on 17 down to 16. That's why this one is showing up on this particular report. This one looks the same, but if we were to dig into it, you'll notice that there is a difference, 245, 400, once you start blowing this out to a more detailed number there. This number is definitely lower than the one before that. So don't get confused by that in the display. But anyway, how do you build it? So I'm going to click on new report. Okay, so this one, unfortunately, we don't have a nice downward trending report. If we did, we would click on that. If you want to get into a more advanced one, you need to click report writer on the right. All right, so I'll go ahead and click on that. I'll click next, and I'm going to quickly say I want measure value and color brought across as my columns. So I need to actually pick what columns I want on the report if I pick report writer. So I've got more work I need to do with that one. Again, I'm short on time, so I'm going to quickly click next there. Now, this one, I wanted 2-month comparison. So whereas on that prior example, I wanted to just leave it as current period to current period, this one I actually want one period earlier on the left to the current period. So one minor tweak there, and I'll click next. Now this one I've got a bunch of work, so I'm going to kind of work my way through this quickly. I'm going to need to filter this down a few ways. One, well, what org tree essentially do I want to limit this down to? So within this list, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can get into. The most popular one is specific scorecard items. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Click next. And again, what I want this on is under mobile world. I'm going to pick on the sales tree again. A little bit different than last time. On this report, I do need to click add on the right-hand side. So if you're playing this back on video, you'll see a little bit different behavior there. We'll click done. And I'm not going to click get report yet because I've got a couple more additional filters I'm going to need to introduce there. So that's step one is, okay, I want my sales measures. Now, in this case, I haven't limited down to just measures. So that's what this next one's going to get into. There's an option called scorecard item type. So this one's a little bit different. There's an option called scorecard item type. I could bring back everything that has gone down, or I could just bring back measures that have gone down. So you'll notice that once I click on something, it turns blue. I'm happy with that. I'll click done. So I've now got 2 different types of filters going on. Now, believe it or not, this last one is the most important. So I've got to make sure I do this last step here. So I'm going to click add one more time. All the way down at the bottom, I'm going to scroll really quick there. There's an option called performance trend. You might not even be aware of that sitting out there. So performance trend, there's an option called the downward. You can play around with that, downward, upward. In this case, I want a downward trending performance. So I'm just going to leave the default. Down at the bottom, this looks good to me, one period earlier to current period. And that's it. I'll click done. And believe it or not, we are through all the 3 filters that we need at this point. All right, so this one's a lot more complex than that nice simple red measures report that I showed you to start, which is why I started with that one. So we'll click get report here. All right, and we'll take a look at this and we'll say, okay, great, you've got a downward trending report that's not showing me the 2nd month of April, the current month. All right, so I do have a problem here that I'm going to need to fix, and I'm going to purposely leave that alone for a second. I'm going to bring this across into dashboards because I want to show you an important point there. So first thing I need to do is save this. I'm going to call this downward trending, if I can type fast, downward trending sales training. Differentiate it again, click save. Scroll this one down by clicking edit just so I make it clear to myself. These are the last 2 things that we've worked on here. Okay, so the red measure one is good. The downward trending one, I've got a little bit of issue that I would recommend cleaning it up immediately. But when I want to enforce a point in the dashboard side of this to enforce a functionality behavior there to make sure you see it. Okay, so we're going to leave this alone. We're going to go to dashboards, and we're essentially going to try to reproduce part of this dashboard. And to do that, what I'm going to do is walk you through this. So to build up a dashboard, we say new dashboard, give it a name, intervention required training. Worked on this yesterday, so all this stuff is nicely coming across without me having to type it from scratch. And then the last step is to click create. All right, so what I'm looking to do now is click on the add or plus option here. And if you've got reports built up, believe it or not, within this panel here, you can just go right to report to click on that. And now your step is to say, okay, well, what report do you want to bring in? And what I want to bring across is 2. So these are why I just scroll these down to the bottom. It makes it a lot easier here. Is that I want this red measure training one, and I want this downward trending training one. Say that 100 times fast. And at this point now I can click away and start playing around with the location of these 2 options, 2 reports on the dashboard, okay? So this is looking good to me, kind of, right? So if I'm playing around with this, typically I save along the way. to make sure my changes are saved. Now, at this point, I might say, oh no, I'm taking a look at my downward trending report, and for the first time I catch that this report is only showing me March when I'm expecting really March and April for this report to really do what I want it to do. Now, you'll notice that we do have an option to go into edit here, but the things that you can change here have nothing to do with the build of the report itself. It only has to do with things like the display, the font size, the background color, and things like that. So that's the bad news. What would have been smarter for me is to fix that before I brought this onto the dashboard. All right, so now I'm going to quickly clean that up, and I'll show you how you can go, if you ever get yourself into this pickle, you can go back to charts and reports. You don't have to rebuild the whole report. Just go to the one that's messed up, click edit, figure out what's wrong here. And what's broken is this date range is not just working correctly here. You'll notice that I do need to fix this right now to make sure that this pulls across the correct display. And for whatever reason, that didn't come across before. But now if I click finish, you'll see this gets updated here. I'll click save and done. And now you'll see that I've successfully got those two columns brought across, okay? So this is what I should have done before. I wanted to illustrate this upcoming point here. So I've got that looking good. Let me go back to dashboards. Let me go back to this one that we're building here. And you're gonna say, oh, let me take a look. Do I see March and April? No. If I click refresh up in the top left, do I see March and April? No, okay. So the key point here is that once you bring an item, a report onto the dashboard, it brings across the look of that report at that time. Any changes to the report structure, like I just did, does not come across. There's not a permanent link between the two. All right, so that's the bad news. The good news is it's pretty quick to fix it. All right, all I need to do is go to edit, delete this one. I can click my delete key. I can click this one, this edit option here, and click delete to bring that across. And again, I'll quickly bring that across by clicking add report, bring the updated report downward trending, and drop that in and click save. Now I'm running short on time here, but one of the other things, if I click done here, let's quickly reference this, is you'll notice I've got some nice little images that were brought across, an exclamation point, a downward trending option. Now I could go into these, to each dashboard, I could go in and click edit, add, and add in an image right from within this location here. Notice that there's an option called upload image or add shared. Now, if this was just like a one-time thing where I never want to bring across an exclamation point anywhere else on any other dashboard, you can just do a one-time upload here. Typically, that's not the case. All right, usually what I want to do and stress the point here is that there's a better way of handling that, and that is through this files section. You'll notice that I've already got the exclamation mark uploaded to this location and the downward arrow here. What's nice about this, if you go about this path using files, you might need to tweak those images, and there's ability to drag and drop revisions to each of those. If you leverage this path here by using files and the option that I'll show you in a second, any revision will automatically cascade across of that image to all of your dashboards that have it. So really important thing to understand there. So I'm just going to show you that path now by going to our custom dashboard that we're building here. Add widget, same option, image. The key trick now is once I've got those images and files, which I've already uploaded, don't have time to show you the actual upload there, but I'm going to go ahead and grab one of those two images right now. I'm just going to pick on the exclamation mark, click add. You'll notice it comes across this way. This image can now be resized and dragged, made to look beautiful here and drop up at the top there. And I'll just leave it at that for now, but just kind of give you a feel for how you bring across images and the recommended way to bring across an image by using the shared image option there. Okay, so I'll click save. I'm not going to worry about my downward trending icon there. All right, so last thing I want to show you here is a year-to-date dashboard. Now, we are short on time. The good news is I did cover this in our general admin session. So way back in April, I covered this in a lot more detail. So I'm going to bring this up because I do feel like it's relevant today. One thing that I just want to show you with this, I love this dashboard in that it shows me year to date through the prior month, how am I doing with maybe my most critical measures? Product revenue, we've touched on that a number of times. Training revenue, book, total revenue. How are all these things doing? And what you'll notice in this layout here is you'll see that in this display, I can get a lot of information using this year-to-date dashboard here. And what's great with this is I can see great product revenue from the past 3 years through April 2019. We were all the way down here. We're trending way up. So this measure is spot on, exactly doing what we want. Training revenue perfectly flat. We might say, yeah, great. You know, we're happy with that. We're happy with the consistent, ever consistent performance with training revenue. Book revenue, on the other hand, not so great. All right. So if we were to keep those 3 measures we were honing in on, this might be the measure I need to figure out. Hey, we've got a huge problem here. We're trending in the wrong direction on this one. Now, the good news is, look at the scale. Product revenue is in the millions here. So this uptick that we're noticing is at a greater scale than the downtick on book revenue. Because that's true, this one's flat. Total revenue is also basically trending up and looks like the chart up in the top left, just because of the scale of those changes there. Okay, so I wanted to show you this dashboard. Great thing to work with. The last thing I'm going to leave you with is, well, what is the trick with getting this to work? And I'm just going to click on Edit. I'm going to click on this, just one of the charts here, go into an option called Edit Chart. And you'll notice a couple things here. I've leveraged within this option called, there's an option to add in a chart. A couple tricks were to use a counter called YTD. I'll show you that in 1 second. The type was by date, and you'll notice that I'm bringing across 3 periods of time, 2018 through the prior month of 2020, okay? So that's a couple of the pieces there in the buildup of the chart. Important to see that. The last thing I'm going to show you is tucked away under settings on the bottom left. There's a calendars option. Again, I got into this a lot back in April. I do have a custom calendar called YTD. The trick with this is that every month, once a period closes, I'm going in and building up. Right now, I've got 3 years that I'm concerned about. I could add in 2017 if I wanted it, and so on. But the key here is that I'm going in each month and editing the through month, and I'm also adjusting the date. So once May is closed, this would be 5/31. This would say through May, and I would do that for each of those 3 periods out there and be done with that change. And once that's true, and once that's been updated, this year to date would now say through May, through May, through May, with the appropriate years there. All right, so really, really good thing to be aware of there. All right, I'm just about out of breath. And the good news is I am done, okay? So let's go back to our PowerPoint. Sorry, we went a little bit over here. And I'm just gonna pull this slide up so you get our contact information here. Again. All right, so hopefully you all found that to be informative. A recording of the session will be made available later this week. Our next session will be next Thursday, May 28th. It's going to be led by Tom Keating. I'll be joining that one as well. Tom's going to take the lead on that. Basically, we're going to be having an Ask the Expert session, and we'll do our best to address specific questions that have been posted to us over the past few weeks. So with that, I say thanks for coming, and we hope to see you all again next week. Take care.